Değerli konuklar, sevgili Bilim Akademisi dostları, sevgili üyelerimiz, değerli meslektaşlarımız. Bu İngilizce bir etkinlik olacağı için bundan sonrası İngilizce devam edeceğim. Dear colleagues, esteemed colleagues, friends of Bilim Akademisi Science Academy Turkey, welcome. I'm Canan Atılgan, President of Science Academy Turkey. It's great to see this unique group of people to attend and take and sip through the great talk we will hear in a few minutes from our colleague Robin Coningham today. I just would like to first give you a background of how we started out with these Conference of the Year and what we have done this year in Science Academy, as this is an end-of-year occasion for us as well. So I would first like to start by thanking Ayşe Buğra. She's here. I think she's over there. She is the person who came up with the original idea that Science Academy is a young academy, I mean young in age, that we should have a Conference of the Year every year, and she has been supporting us ever since. Thank you very much, Hocam, for this. This year we have a big sponsor, Bank ABC, which sponsored all our earthquake-related events. And today they are represented by Muzaffer Aksoy. He's here. Thank you for being here and thank you for your support. He's the CEO of Bank ABC Turkey, and their help has been great so that we have been, I think, as a Science Academy, quite impactful. And we will continue to be with the disaster and how to relate science to disaster, idea of disasters in Turkey. We also thank İşsanat, who is hosting us here today. They have given their event room to us. And I would like to thank Tülin Hadi, President of Istanbul City Council. She connected us with Istanbul Municipality, and they gave us yesterday a wonderful tour of many archaeological sites in Istanbul, and Robin had a great chance to see how people are working on how we're dealing with restoration efforts with cultural heritage sites in Turkey. And I would also like to introduce our President-elect, Hakan Örer. So we have moved on to a President-elect ex officio type of overseeing of Science Academy events. So last week we have elected our first President-elect, and he's also here with us today. Thank you for being here. So this year we have done a lot of activities, and some of those centered around the idea of centennial of the Turkish Republic. We had started preparing for this last year, and we had an ad hoc committee coming up with ideas, and we converged on this idea of having panels with interdisciplinary scientists focusing on certain topics, and then discussing how the Turkish Republic dealt with that topic for the first 100 years. And then maybe for the majority of the panel, after summarizing what has been done, to look into the future and to say what will be done, what should be done in light of science in that topic. So we started out with our health panel in January, but then came the big earthquake, unfortunately, in February. So we imported this idea into a set of panels, a series of panels centered around the idea of how to deal with disasters, how to prevent disasters blowing out of proportion, if you will. And these events were the first ones that we supported with Bank ABC's support, as I mentioned earlier. And then, since September, we have come back to our centennial panels, and we have done one on economics, another one on agriculture. We will have one on next month on law and health. Education in February, and we have done one with the feedback between political science and the new data age and how they are feeding on each other. So those are our panels that we had. In addition, with the earthquake efforts, we had workshop on minimizing natural disasters in light of loss from natural disaster and how to diminish that. So we had that in October 1st. Its results are coming out. It will be published in the future, by March, I should say. Another thing we have, of course, we have continued to do what we always do. One of them is our yearly report on academic freedoms. We also try to put positive, it's a report, so all positive and negative are in there, but usually for Turkey, and unfortunately, more and more in the past years, we have a lot of negative examples on the situation of academic freedoms in Turkey. Our law professors, law members, are members from the from this topic, from this area, are preparing the next one for the year 2023. It will be published, we hope, in January. We, of course, continued our other usual activities for young scientists, with Young Scientist Awards. We have announced the next one, and we're about to open it for next year. Summer schools, which we had one on artificial intelligence and another one on social sciences. But coming back to the idea of the centennial, our big project was Sahada, in the field, a book that we published right before the 100th year anniversary of the Republic. It has a lot of effort went into it, and you can see the book outside, and you can buy it and have a look at it. It is talking about 12 women scientists educated in the first years, in the first couple of decades of the Turkish Republic, who worked in the field. So they, on top of being a woman in a new republic, in the age of women being new scientists, new to science everywhere in the world, they actually did their science in the field. So there's like that extra layer of hardship that they had to face, and it's great to follow their stories in this book, and I hope you see it and you enjoy it. But now I come to tonight. So I attended ALEA, all European academies, of which Bilim Akademisi Science Academy Turkey is a member, and I attended their meeting in the UK, in London, in June, and they had one open to public day, and for that part, this year it was titled "Crises and Importance of Research: How Prepared Can We Be?" And it was obviously very relevant because we had just come out of the earthquake, and we were trying to do, all of us were still trying to do our best. We still are, about how to put science at the forefront of relief efforts. So there was this first panel on diversity and inclusivity in disaster responses, and Robin was one of the panelists on that panel. And and we were thinking about who to invite this year for the conference of the year, and we had this idea at the back of our minds about somebody, a cutting-edge scientist who would kind of bring us lessons for the next centennial of the Turkish Republic, but also might be related to the disaster we had just come out of. So we thought that might be a great idea to invite Robin to be our speaker, and he accepted. But just to give you an idea why we did invite him, during that panel, his comments on how, in the heat of the moment, decisions made can have irreversible effects on cultural heritage and it resonated with me all too well. Actually, I would like to quote from the 2021 ICOMOS UNESCO IPCC meeting co-sponsored by these three, and where he was one of the 100 invitees. This is from there, and I think it's going to be relevant for you. It says, crises and disasters, human or natural, often overwhelm planned responses and create situations in which technical interventions are hurriedly applied, but later found to compromise existing management and protection agendas and alienate resident communities and threaten their heritage and values. We know all too well that the connectivity of people to their where they used to live after the disaster has been quite hampered, and this is one cultural heritage is one important point to connect. Scientifically, Robin's approach to integration of science-based and traditional indigenous knowledge systems is intriguing, and I personally think it is the way forward in this age of climate action adaptation and carbon mitigation, in addition to the other natural disasters. So I would just like to introduce him a little bit. He is the UNESCO Chair on Archaeological Ethics and Practice in Cultural Heritage at Durham University. So that already says a lot. There's a lot there. This chair has this task of being multidisciplinary, it's a multidisciplinary research cluster, a network exploring issues of ethics and practice relating to heritage and archaeology. Predominantly, it started with South Asia and the UK, but recently it expanded to the Middle East, North Africa, and elsewhere in Asia Pacific. And when I say interdisciplinarity, I really mean it. It's anthropology, history, engineering, philosophy, museums, business school, all of them put together. So you have to be this person who makes all these fields talk to each other. So Robin, in addition to holding this chair, has co-directed, he has joined over 30 international missions for UNESCO, so he's very knowledgeable in this field. And he has co-directed UNESCO's archaeological fieldwork at Nepal since 2011, and he was invited to co-direct post-disaster interventions in Kathmandu Valley, post the disaster there in 2015. He was involved in co-designing post-disaster methodologies which have been successfully applied in Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka and Mosul in Iraq. He is the author of books and many important publications. So today he will relate lessons learned from the past for the future. Isn't that great, what we're looking for? Unlocking the potential of heritage science research during natural and human disasters and crises. Robin, thank you for being here. The floor is yours, finally.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm hoping that some of those pointers will pick up in the presentation. I am extremely grateful to the Academy for entertaining me, for both inviting and entertaining me. Yesterday's tour of sites was eye-opening for me, and also to Kanan, to Elif, Defin, and also Asli for giving me a really good sense of some of the challenges ahead, as well as fascinating to see what Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality is doing. I will take you on a journey across South Asia and across disasters. And I'm hoping that at the end of it, you will share some of my understanding and also some of the passion, and also, I'm hoping, share some of the challenges as well. Much of what I will talk actually stems from both those post-disaster Mirasta activities that your president mentioned, but also a paper that was invited by the Journal of the British Academy that I wrote with my colleague Lisa Lucero from the US, where we were specifically timed to coincide this special number with COP28 at the time, to look at how lessons could be learned for the future in terms of sustainability. That paper, I'm glad to say, is open access. In it, we gave a series of key messages that we wanted to put forward as archaeologists and practitioners. The first was actually to identify the huge potential of archaeology and what we would call heritage science. Because in a way, we give a unique position, a deep position, a position which actually allows us to look at evidence over centuries, if not millennia, of adaptation. Secondly, actually, in terms of most of us, we deal with societies that have collapsed and eclipsed, cities which are desolate, which have failed. And in many cases, we can see how attempts to adapt have been undertaken, but actually many of them have struggled to meet those long-term crises. And also to flag that even with successful adaptation, actually there can be irreversible pathway dependencies, which mean that a particular technological solution to a particular challenge can end up with a change in the variables being irreversible, and therefore what one might say is a different social and economic scaling, which one might think of as societal collapse. Also, we were critical of ourselves and critical also of our discipline, to say that actually we're very comfortable talking to ourselves. We're very comfortable talking to other archaeologists, published to other archaeologists, indeed being peer-reviewed by other archaeologists. What we don't really do is reach out beyond to other disciplines, and most importantly to communities, the communities involved, and also to policymakers. Otherwise we end up talking within a vacuum. For those, I know that the scientists here will want definitions. They'll want me to set out my methodology. Here, heritage science, I'm not trying to create a new discipline. This is an emergent feature, certainly recognized within the UK, where we see this as being inherently interdisciplinary. We see this as systematic, science-based, evidence-led examination, investigation of heritage across disciplines, across the traditional disciplines that we might see as silos. So that's the working hypothesis borrowed from my colleague Sarah Semple of heritage science. I thought you would like an outline to know how you're going, so I will take you first of all to the earthquake, questions of resilience, adaptation, then to conflict, one of the longest running civil wars in southern Asia, and then to absolutely new work, which is work supported by the Royal Society, Royal Academy of Engineering and British Academy, cross-academy interdisciplinary work, looking at the challenge of water and water harvesting, and then offer you a prospect to try and entice you. And also greetings from Durham. Durham is an old university, the third oldest in England, but also the owner and manager of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, along with the Church of England. One end is the cathedral, the other end is the castle where the university was born. So we come with a responsibility for that. I am an archaeologist. In the UK, in your first year as an undergraduate, you specialise. I specialised in Southern Asia. Most of my early career, I spent down 30-foot holes. excavating abandoned cities, trying to build chronologies, trying to understand trade, and trying to build chronologies, many of which came through in the volume by Cambridge University Press. Now, where I began to find my journey changing was also I work on living sites, not just dead sites. Sites of living significance, in particular the birthplace of the Buddha here, the originator of Buddhism in Nepal, but also these are living sites with the challenges of how do you deal with huge numbers of pilgrims. In the time I've worked in Nepal, pilgrimage has lifted from about 16,000 a year to 1.2 million. How do you create the infrastructure? How do you protect? And also, how do you see this disseminate? Here is in Burma with the President of Nepal on her state visit with exhibitions. And also, how do you begin to educate, to touch the next communities, the next stakeholders, the children and the communities living at such heritage sites without actually excluding them? These factors led to the creation in 2014 of the UNESCO chair. We believe that actually cultural heritage is core to enabling the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. In particular, we focus on quality education, water, sustainable cities and communities, and partnership for the goals. And increasingly, we attempt to record our work, our research, against the SDGs. We're also aware that actually the SDG contributions are at risk from natural and also human agency disasters. We work on social and economic impacts, mentoring, standards, we disseminate, we co-develop, we develop networks, and also we invest in mobility and capacity strengthening. These are some of our partners. As you can see, it's an incomplete map stretching from Southeast Asia up to Europe and the UK, with notable gaps. We are only a team of 3. And also, these are some of the funders. Some of these include Royal Society, Royal Academy of Engineering, but also we realise the contributions that others can make. And those threats are very real. This is a list of the 14 primary threats just to UNESCO World Heritage Sites. These are drawn from UNESCO. This list is actually available from their state of conservation. As you can see, increasingly, over time, human activities, including conflict, targeting of sites, climate change, and also sudden ecological or geological events, including earthquakes, have built. This particular graph purely displays earthquake and the effect. And this is just a microcosm. These are just UNESCO World Heritage Sites. My first example is from this one example in 2015. So 2015 for me, in a way, changed me from being an archaeologist purely interested in chronologies, long dead societies, into trying to understand what is the role of archaeology. When your heritage, which one day is counted as UNESCO World Heritage status, and the next the army is driving bulldozers on it, clearance is happening, scaffolding is everywhere. How do you cope with such an environment? And indeed, when bilaterally you start seeing the flags of the Japanese, of the Chinese, of the Americans, and there is a race to reconstruct, particularly, for example, in Nepal, where such a large proportion of GDP is from tourism, actually clearing and putting it back on the tourist map was a major, major push. So, what is the purpose? What is the role? What is the relevance of archaeology and heritage science? Do we purely hunker down and look for what are called earthquake effects, archaeological earthquake effects? Do we look at archaeological sites and say, yes, there was an earthquake here? Or do we start actually contributing our professionalism, our practitioner experience, and try to make a difference which is positive? These were the challenges that we felt sitting in Durham watching the reports of the disaster unraveling in Nepal. And as Kanan mentioned, these actually were increasingly picked up elsewhere. So I was the British Academy representative on this session, Diversity and Inclusivity and Disaster Responses in the summer, and this was around crises and the importance, the role of research. Research should play a major role within disasters. And there is a need, some of the key messages, to involve local communities, not to exclude them. And also that actually you can't just parachute experts in, you need longitudinal relationships. And also funding is very, very seldom available. I gave a list of rather horrible challenges. I won't list them all here, but these are some of the challenges that actually are absolutely core to the disasters. Some are about capacity, some are about funding, some are about timing, and some are about that very difficult sort of articulation between cutting-edge science and traditional knowledge systems. And also, as I know that there are economists in the audience, the fact that also we rarely monetize cultural heritage. So when one is beginning to calculate loss, actually cultural heritage rarely features. It's just a rebuild cost. Therefore, in terms of prioritization, it languishes low. I'll come back to these towards the end, but I wanted to demonstrate it's a long list, and I'm hoping that you'll share some of them with me. So the first case example is of earthquake. So it's the earthquake taken from Kathmandu. These both sides are World Heritage properties. This is within 3 hours of the disaster, and these are bulldozers which have been mobilized. Now, Nepal has experienced an earthquake probably every 100 years. It's recorded historically. And also, as you can see, in terms of climate change, it also sits as fourth in the world in terms of climate risk. So there is, in a way, a perfect storm here. 25th of April, 2015 was the earthquake. Numbers are very difficult to come by. Some 9,000 fatalities, some 20,000 injured, and almost 500,000 houses lost. Within the World Heritage property, 131 structures came down. Initial costs of 129 million, soon scaled up. One of the most striking features, though, was that intangible heritage continued. In the immediate aftermath, knowing that aftershocks were coming, the army started pulling down buildings that were damaged to prevent further loss of life. Bulldozers were sent in to clear the streets, because that's one of the top priorities, to clear the streets. And also, these structures, when they were cleared, material was removed. Even the foundations of these buildings were just being dug out. So one moment these were UNESCO World Heritage properties, the next day they were disaster zones and treated as such. And indeed, here you can see the process from the bulldozer into the truck, mixing historic medieval material, earlier material with modern material, and then all of it just dumped. So during the emergency response, There was mixing, there was loss of cultural material, location of material. UNDP's 2013, and it hasn't been updated, debris management doesn't mention what to do with cultural debris. And in fact, UNESCO office at the time was desperately trying to identify what should be done with the amount of cultural debris. One of the most striking factors, only that came through later, was if you imagine how many historic bricks were thrown with modern material into landfill, each one costs £1.34 to replace, with all the additional cultural and environmental impacts as well. Now, having spent time criticising the first responders, we actually were given the opportunity to work with first responders. So we were given a grouping of officers from the army and the police, and one of the buildings that had come down in the earthquake, we were asked to see if we could co-design with them a method that would be applicable and swift. So we created a very simple grid. We made a duplicate grid. Everything from this square was moved to there, everything from this square to there, just to see, could we look at methods that would keep location as key? And also, could one actually begin to differentiate between materials that could be dumped and materials that could be recycled? And those went into a first draft of a post-disaster book for first responders. We're also aware that many of the major services were damaged: drains, sewers, water lines. And so there began to be, in all of the open spaces, new cuttings to relay pipelines, huge investment. But actually, there was this view that because these huge palace squares were open, there was a view that perhaps they'd always been open. This is one of my colleagues, Manju Singh, using a penetrating GPR, ground-penetrating radar, because of course these are brick, these are stone, but radar can get through. This is the result of that area within the palatial compound. You can see modern utilities. These are utility lines. But also, if you look very clearly, you can see a series at the depth of 1.1 metre of buildings. Just because the area is open doesn't mean that it's always been open in the past. Just because it looks like you can lay services there doesn't mean that that is a case that will not damage heritage. So in fact, we looked through the archival material and we found this building, Lamupati, which actually had been taken down after a later earthquake. So we began to match together these historical images with the GPR results. And indeed, we put in a trench to demonstrate the foundations were literally 20 or 30 centimetres below the surface. Working as a way of demonstrating to local municipality and also to local communities that the heritage was literally beneath their feet, we began to discuss where utilities could be laid. Here are water lines just cutting straight through the cultural heritage below. And we began to trial what we call risk maps. Red means vulnerable archaeology, pink means high risk, green means actually these are areas which archaeologically are less significant. This was shared with the new municipalities so they could start putting in to their plans. We also were aware that many buildings were being excavated out. There was a view that vernacular architecture had failed. Traditional building styles had failed. So a team of this, with funding from British Academy and also Arts and Humanities Research Council, UNESCO and National Geographic, pulled together an interdisciplinary team, and the building we tackled was a building called the Kastamandap, the eponymous building of Kathmandu, which gives it its name. This is a view of the site when we started. It had gone from being a 20-metre high monument to being a pile of rubble. Treating it as an archaeological site, we put in trenches, started excavating. The most striking feature was the foundations had no evidence of earthquake damage. So the question was, this building didn't fail from the foundations. Which element actually failed it? So over the course of about 4 months, we excavated it. Here you can see it as it was when we first did the initial work. This shows steadily as the debris is removed. And this shows you an idea of its foundations below the ground. And here. So we picked up over 4 months an extremely clear view of its actual engineering within. We worked on OSL dating for the foundations. We worked on radiocarbon dating for the temples, for the timbers. And we found a traditional date was 11th century CE. Actually, we pushed it back to about 750 for its initial construction. And some of the timbers even dated to between 450 and 500 CE, giving us this unique biography of a single building, the complexity of the building, the repairs to the building, when this building previously had been really understudied. What was also clear was the timber superstructure locked into the foundations, but one of the locks, one of the saddle stones, was missing. So we began to look at the traditional study of the architecture, and actually most of the architects were only interested in superstructure, not beneath the ground. So looking and excavating under the tile, we found actually this tile dates from the 1960s. During a major renovation of the building, the conservators found one of the timber tenons had broken. They just pushed the tile under, so that when the earthquake hit, 3 of those huge pillars, 4 meters 60 high, supporting the building was locked. 3 of them were locked, 1 of them was loose. During the excavation, we also found evidence of copper sheet between the timber and also the stone, and over the tenons, copper shoes. Now, working with traditional craftsmen, they identified that copper oxidizes. Copper oxide actually retards termites and also rot and deterioration. So this was actually a forgotten traditional knowledge system. We also looked at the fills of the interior cells, and we found that they were not natural. They were highly, what my colleague Ian Simpson calls engineered. Very, very mixed. He found that actually, when we've analysed them in labs, they have a degree of liquefaction proofing within them. And it's interesting that there are Sanskrit treatises which actually link how one should ritually create soils for structures, and so this is an area of interest. But also, these are all set in mud mortar. Mud mortar allows movement from earthquakes, both vertically and horizontally, in a way that lime mortars just lock the structures in a rigid scale. We were very keen for this new knowledge to be extended. So part of what we were doing was municipalities were being brought to see the sites. We were interviewing and working with craftspeople and also communities. And then we felt it was important to actually disseminate. This is the old army barracks turned into a museum. So actually the research and the understanding is not lost, but people actually remember it. Then the building was handed back to the community. The community, this is the ritual to purify the site. And then the community decided they wanted to build back in the same fashion their ancestors had. They used bamboo scaffolding. They used their own community to carry these. These weigh over 1.2 tons. And they have re-erected the monument using their traditions and their technology. And it contributed towards community cohesion and resilience. So this was an example of actually a single example of how a monument could link back to its community. The handbook, the post-disaster handbook, was trialled. Here are the first graduates that we saw through. And also, we thought it was important, community and practitioners from Sri Lanka, from India, from Myanmar, also came and participated in this work because all of them shared the same challenges. The second example I'm going to give you is a direct link to that, because one of the Sri Lankans who came was the Director General of the Central Cultural Fund, my colleague Prashanta Gunawardena. His question was, can you use it for conflict zones? So the zone he gave was Jaffna Fort in the very north of the island of Sri Lanka. Again, with funding from the British Academy, but working. This was the first time the University of Jaffna had worked after the conflict. So the conflict ran from 1983 to 2009. The loss of life was certainly over 70,000. It included in the early years targeting of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, bombing and attacks. The cost was extraordinary. Here's one of the water towers blown up at Kilinochchi. And also, of course, it drove Sinhala and Tamil communities apart. This Dutch fort has always been seen as a symbol of colonialism in the north of the island. Built in 1658, it was part of the Dutch sort of ring to control spice trade. It was actually built on an earlier Portuguese fort. Here's a view of that Portuguese fort, built in 1618, and then it was partly replaced, partly demolished in 1658 after a long siege. It remained a place of government after the British, after independence, and it was a place where judiciary would be, military, and also police. During the Civil War, it was targeted, it was besieged, it was abandoned, and then re-besieged. So this is the Queen's Palace house at the Governor's Palace, as you can see, completely destroyed during the conflict. This was built in the early 1800s. This is the Dutch church. Its bricks are made out of Dutch brick brought as ballast in the Dutch ships. And this was it when we encountered it in 2017 after being bombed. And the question was, can you work on the same sorts of buildings with the same sorts of solutions? Putting in a grid, again, moving material from one square to another, gave a system to try and record. And this is where we've just started gridding out. Here you can see the damaged church. And steadily working with students from all over Sri Lanka, Sinhalese as well as Tamil, actually beginning to clear the monument. Within the monument, monumental records coming out, ornamentation which was all recovered. And some of this we've managed to link back these fragments to some of the published tombstones, for example. Here is when the clearance is continuing, and also coming up with unknown histories. So the published British and Dutch gravestones were known, but here is an unknown 18th century Tamil who was buried here. So an untold history, a hidden history coming through. We also undertook GPR again. Here's my colleague Armin Schmidt. And within the GPR, within the parade ground, you can see it's empty during the Dutch period. With the GPR, you can see in the middle of the parade ground this huge square building. Huge square building, you can see it's over 40 meters by 40 meters with the GPR. Here it is again, putting in excavation trenches. We demonstrated actually it's this lost Portuguese building, the Church of Our Lady of Miracles. That was built on top of earlier buildings, which of course explains the reason, the rationale for the port. It had early Islamic material, it had Chinese material, and before then, Roman contact material. Again, the risk maps were given to the managers so they could start planning the way forward. Also, what's critical for the reconstruction, the fort was built out of coral and Dutch 18th century brick, neither of which are obtainable today. So by recycling and separating it from modern waste, one is able to use authentic materials in the reconstruction. When we were clearing the church, we also found very unexpected huge granite blocks. When you look at the decoration, actually this is from a medieval Tamil temple. The Portuguese are recorded having destroyed over 100 Hindu temples in this area. This actually gives some idea of the splendor of those temples before they were destroyed and reused within the rubble. This was meant to be a temporary exhibition back in 2017. It's still there within the museum. And this was one of the most striking of the exhibits in the three languages, Tamil, Sinhalese, and also English, to demonstrate that if you look at that new antiquity of the site, this colonial building, a Dutch colonial fort, if you look at its new history, and if you condense that into a single day, actually the history of the colonial history starts at 3 minutes before midnight. And actually for our students there, this was really quite a key moment. We're now trying to work with the University of Mosul to see can these techniques, can these approaches also work with mega disasters on the scale of Mosul. So in particular, we had a grant with colleagues from Nottingham Trent University and Mosul University. Unfortunately, none of the risk assessments have allowed colleagues from the UK to travel out there. So we've had workshops in the UK and training. And some of these were focusing on debris and clearance, trying to understand again what was the process of clear-up. Who authorized it? Where was the material taken? How much material was salvaged? What happened to it? And what is the history of materials that actually came? A series of interviews, and we're going through the results now. The final case study is one that is only a month old. Funded through the APEX scheme, Royal Academy of Engineering, British Academy, Royal Society. This is one of the few examples of interdisciplinary funding that we have available to us. And it's completely exploratory. It's for archaeologists to work with engineers to actually see if we can begin to look at questions of regeneration. Can we understand water systems, and can they be utilized today? And indeed, many donors prefer mega infrastructure, which will often come with massive repayments, but actually the benefits, cost analysis of these, frequently it's only later that they're found not to be quite as promising as before. And this is work that we're also doing in tandem with the Austrian Academy of Sciences. So again, Kathmandu, but it not only has that challenge from earthquakes, but also it's urbanizing extremely quickly. From the 1950s, it's grown to about 1.5 million. With seismic threat, there is also additionally the fact that services have not kept up to pace, and water is one of those key issues. Many of the traditional ponds have dried up, many of the takeoffs on the traditional water systems. This provides the water for one of the towns, the municipalities within Kathmandu, and many people rely on some of the older systems for their water systems. Asia Development Bank has a almost $500 million project to create a 26-mile long tunnel to engineer the solutions. Again, many individuals are seeing a massive loss of land, a top-down approach, a huge administration associated with this. Our project is trying to look at medieval water systems. So we're looking at a period called the Lichvi, early medieval, 5th to 8th century, where there is a very striking system of water, taking water up near the mountains, headwaters, and then piping it with inscriptions recording donations, maintenance, re-establishment, and many of these systems are still working today. The communities still use them. Intangible heritage is connected with them. So we are now, over the next year, exploring to what extent we can track the development of these, also the engineering of these, and also their potential utility, here demonstrated with a modern water pipe directly over a medieval water pipe. We are archaeologists, we're epigraphers, geotechnical engineers, water engineers, and also heritage managers, policy makers, municipalities, because there's no point that us doing this on our own, and the communities. We're looking at these canal systems, medieval canal systems, 3 in case, that we're going to work on later. Some of them suffer from landslides, but many of them don't, trying to understand the seismic and landslide threats to them, whether it's connected with land use, but also those threats. So, for example, this house has been directly built over one of these lines. You can see the line moves around it. You have discharge from waste into some of them, and then here's a huge milk factory built almost on top of one of these channels. Trying to understand the levels of protection and also management. It's an area which archaeology comes into haphazard because these are chance discoveries. Here is a water channel, here is one of the pipes. Most intriguingly, this was a recent discovery of timber pipework, which is extremely flexible during earthquakes, also buried beneath the ground. It's anaerobic, it doesn't rot. It's actually a really, really very smart technological knowledge system that we're going to take radiocarbon dates to date. And also, this is partly meeting interest from local community who are trying to preserve their intangible heritage linked to this. So these are the key messages from the beginning, and one of them was that we can't just talk to ourselves or enlighten audiences, we also need to talk to policymakers. Back in 2017, we held a SARC, a South Asia World wide meeting focusing on policymakers as well, including ministers of culture and secretaries of culture. Within that, one of the key features was re-examining what do we mean by Build Back Better? Is it a technological solution? Is this a societal solution? And actually, can we unlock interdisciplinary research and also still answer to communities? Some of the papers that my engineering colleagues have published have begun to look at how do you bridge between traditional knowledge systems and the knowledge systems of modern cutting-edge science. But also we've been working with municipalities and governments to bring in conservation guidelines. That in the race to put in new services, actually this is Government of Nepal passed by the Ministry of Culture, that now heritage impact assessment should be carried out before services are put in. This photo was taken before. Here you can see this is wastewater, and here is an archaeological building down within, just dug out with JCBs. So actually, the municipality, the Ministry of Culture is listening to these impacts and changing the guidelines and the heritage impact assessments. Other ways that we've tried to link have been through the UK National Commission to UNESCO in order to influence UNESCO head office and putting back on the fact that actually heritage and disasters cannot just be a suspension of normal protection of heritage, as is often the case. And then actually your president read this quote from the UNESCO ICOMOS IPCC, the Global Research and Action Agenda, which is really refocusing on the fact that disasters, people tend to suspend any interest or protection of cultural heritage, and also we lose that historical understanding of adaptation, experimentation, and traditional knowledge systems, replaced with apparently building back better. So there's a final key message I would add, actually, that future disasters are a given. No matter what we hope, there will be disasters. But we need to actually look to the past, because that can help us how we devise challenges, how we identify challenges, devise strategies, and also deliver sustainable solutions. Here are some of the links that you can follow if you're interested in this. We go for dual-lingual online exhibitions, a way of reaching broader communities, as well as the traditional writing, as well as policy, such as the piece with ICOMOS and the IPCC. The acknowledgements are to all of those teams, whether in Kathmandu, the first responders, or in Jaffna, for their support within this. And also a rather wet team yesterday for showing me some of the challenges here. And I would like to just go back to that list, because this is a list which needs to be shared. So certainly I'll de-stress myself by sharing it with you. Overall, there is a lack of multilateral, multidisciplinary projects and team working. The training we deliver to our students tends to be monodisciplinary. And indeed, this is the case for whether within disasters or within higher education. Until we change those, we will not be agile. Research into heritage is a luxury. Into disasters, it's even rarer. We have this challenge that actually cultural heritage, intangible heritage, is extremely difficult to monetize. How can you identify loss? How can you reinvigorate? And also, it's rarely mapped against the SDGs. And it can be. We've just run a pilot in County Durham on it. Tangible and intangible tend to be different ministries, different laws, different protection. Really, they can be bound together. Inventories. Inventories are almost always extremely incomplete, often duplicated, and also they're lists rather than actively seeking to understand management and to manage risk. Traditional knowledge systems are neglected. They don't have ISOs. You know the strength of steel, you know the strength of concrete, but actually 700-year-old timber is very difficult to identify. Indigenous practitioners do not have PhDs, masters, diplomas. They have years of experience. But how do you put that into a tendering system? And also, communities are often completely excluded from the process. And at the end, they're invited back and almost expected to thank you for having excluded and completely transformed their cultural ecosystems. They've got to be at the front. Groups, when they come in, are not really focused on ethical and equitable partnerships. There is a disaster industry that moves from disaster to disaster to disaster. And then researchers are happy to be observers, sometimes critical observers, but actually the only way to make changes is to work with policy and decision makers, not just to remain observers. And then a final one is lessons learned. We're almost 9 years after the 2015 Gurkha earthquake in Kathmandu. We're still deliberating about how best to frame the lessons learned document. So actually, part of this is thinking about, do we focus on approaches? Are we honest about successes, challenges, and also hybrids? Frequently, engineers have experimented, architects have experimented, different materials, different strengths, different qualities. Have they worked? Have they not worked? Everything is a little, too late. Thank you very much.
Well, with your list, I think with everyone in the audience, we all thought of recent experiences with each item in your list. So the floor is open to the questions, please.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm not in the field, but from not directly related to the disaster problem, do you think that even the modernity, actually, if it is imported, it is a big threat to the heritage in general? And sometimes the authorities even think that earthquakes could be a good opportunity for them to level the whole thing and then do the build something from scratch. But I wonder your comment.
Yes, I thank you very much for the trap that you're laying for me. I think it's clear from the past that communities have made use of the disasters to make massive changes. So, whether you look at, say, the Great Fire of London led to the opportunity of completely remodeling, redesigning parts of London. If you look at some of the archaeological evidence from the Kathmandu Valley, we've had buildings just removed, squares opened up. I think there is a tendency in our contemporary time for decision makers to see it as an opportunity to remodel. Often land pooling, to redistribute land, redistribute communities, to remodel, sometimes under a cloak of Build Back Better. And it's interesting, in various parts of South Asia, we have seen disasters leading to top-down redevelopment that has seen communities relocated. Similarly with river bodies, with beautification, removing informal settlements, this has traditionally been used. So I think there is a real danger that these sorts of humanitarian disasters then unlock the opportunity to completely remodel and to completely alienate communities. So I think for some decision makers, they do make use of blank canvases. And partly by putting up a fence, you remove people by the way you clear, by the involvement in community, you can completely disassociate the communities. One of the aspects we found in Kathmandu was you tend to think of tangible as the stronger than intangible. But we found some of the slides that I almost showed were a procession bringing a statue of Lord Ganesh around a pile of rubble in the middle of a square, because that's what the community always do on that day. And actually, the intangible was keeping the tangible alive until its reconstruction. So I think the moment you start removing communities like that, you really do destroy those communities and their intangible heritage. Thank you for your question.
Thank you for sharing your experiences recovering and the role of cultural heritage in recovering the buildings and natural disaster areas. But cultural heritage studies are much bigger than just recovering buildings. Also recovering artifacts and understanding the details. I wanted to just mention that cultural heritage is now recognized as a legitimate science, which is a combination of archaeology, ethnography, and so on. So it's a new development in the last decade, basically. One of the major tools of cultural heritage studies, of course, is recovering objects that are not readable. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to remind you that there's a wonderful facility in the Middle East, in Jordan, called Sesame, mm-hmm. which recognizes cultural heritage as their major area of effort. And I invite you to sometimes come to Sesame to tell us your experiences and look at what we can offer.
Thank you very much. I agree. Heritage science and cultural heritage is increasingly, I think, divergent, because to some extent there is critical heritage studies, which seems to be partly deconstructionalist in approach. I think the view that many of my colleagues take in Durham, that I think we share with you, is that actually it's the natural physical sciences which is part of the core of unlocking cultural heritage in terms of value. So I would certainly like to take you up on that invitation, most certainly. Thank you. Thank you.
Just about that point of yours, authorities sometimes use disasters to eliminate heritage and rebuild. Don't you think that communities too sometimes participate in that reckless elimination of the past to open the way to advantages of a practical or economic kind? Thank you.
Yes, I would say communities do that. Having worked in South Asia for many years, there are many examples of heritage being targeted by different communities within similar settlements, and also there is this sort of concept of heritage can be weaponized. Cultural heritage is not inherently benevolent. It can be weaponized. I know that's a harsh term to use, but it can be. If you look at the birth of archaeology as a discipline, you could argue that actually it emerges at a time when Napoleon is unifying and putting in a single code across Europe. And that's the period where you could argue that actually the Danes, having had territorial losses, begin to introspectively look at their own heritage and history. And so you could argue that the origins of archaeology as a discipline is both a response to that and connected with the growth of nationalism, and also you could argue that archaeology has a long shadow from imperialism as well. I would say that we have to acknowledge those as part of our sort of process, perhaps, of decolonization, but that heritage is by no means benign. It can be used as a motivator for positive development, for contributions towards the SDG, or it can be used, as we argue, within the UNESCO chair, it can be misused to accelerate losses against the SDGs. Yes, it's certainly not neutral.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was wondering, I really like the way you described building as community making in your project in Nepal. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What kind of strategies you used to involve the community there, and then like how did the process went on afterwards?
Yeah. It's difficult to realize at what point the tipping point comes, because it was a mound of rubble. We started intervening there. Community began to be interested, but not particularly, because I think in a way in their minds it was going to be reconstructed anyway. When the work began to produce these exceptional results that, you know, there was the oldest piece of timber from an architectural building within Nepal. Once they began to see in our trenches the fact that there was no earthquake damage, despite there being centuries of, you know, an earthquake every century, and the building had little evidence of damage. And once they began to see that actually the reason for its collapse was poor conservation in the 60s, it completely changed the community's attitude towards the building. There was a proposal to put in huge piers, pour concrete in, steel piers, to reconstruct it on a solid foundation. The community, with the support of their elected members of the wards, rejected it in a public meeting. And they then assembled their own expert committee of artisans, of professors of vernacular architecture from Tribhuvan University, and they then designed their approach to it. The municipality then actually handed over the funds for this work to the community to then manage. Our work, in a way, was to be the tipping point, and we were giving the technological evidence, but then actually we were really lucky that ICOMOS Nepal has a really very, I think, expert team of architects and engineers who were really interested in seeing the project to see if they could reconstruct it using the traditional techniques. And at that point, it tipped from being a disaster zone to being a focus of community resilience. So I would say we were within the tipping point at the beginning, but then at the end, we were superfluous, which in a way was perfect. So our role was finished. The technological knowledge had been utilized. The copper workers reworked those beautiful copper shoes, the new platforms, and then the community took it. And for me, that was everything, because there is no call for a neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism, and actually our route was as technical advisors, and then we could hand over. So that was, yes, the key point. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have one question. And as you know, the latest disaster affected Turkey a lot, and especially we call it Antakya or Antioch. And do you have any study or plan for that region, for Turkey? Thank you. I had a very fascinating meeting this morning
with Işığında, who I believe may, yes, there, which was a little, well, hugely reminiscent of other disasters in terms of clearance, in terms of material not being reused, in terms of material, or even understanding why buildings came down. You know, my question always is, why at this point did some of the historic buildings come down? Was it due to modern conservation interventions? Was it that it was a particular magnitude? Was it, you know, what were the key features involved to understand not just building back replicas, but actually seeing if one could reconstruct? And so looking at it, it looks like it's a sort of ground zero. Most of the structures have been removed. Some of the buildings still look like they have not been removed. You could do a forensic engineering analysis of why they came down, which points were the failings. That would help understand whether it's a flaw within modern cements and repointing that's actually created too much rigidity when normally there's movement, or a particular movement. So I would say I'm off to Nepal for 2 months. But for us, we would be extremely interested in terms of sharing lessons learned, and also, you know, I'm hand on heart, I'm not a specialist in this region, but there are analogues, examples that surely are core. And also, I would say, even looking forward, there are lessons learned so that the next time it can be avoided again. So I would say now is the time. You know, we're trying to do lessons learned 9 years on. Most people want to move on or have forgotten. Now is the time to do lessons learned. Who made decisions to clear material? Who made decisions where to dump the material? Who made the decisions and where, which material selected, what not selected? Those are key for understanding for the next disaster. It may not be, you know, inshallah, it will not be in Turkey, it will be somewhere else, but there will be a disaster on that scale. So the lessons learned are key. And, you know, like in Mosul, we were not there physically, but we're extremely happy to share the questionnaires to start understanding what advice can we give? How can we make that UNDP sort of quick guide a more successful guide that will protect heritage as well? So I would say, I'm always told I say yes. I would be extremely interested, but I'm also pragmatic enough to realize that it may be too late in most cases, but the lessons are never too late for some communities. Thank you.
Thank you for this fascinating lecture. I have a question about whether the lessons from the past can be translated to the future, because I'm particularly interested in climate change, and climate change has great relevance as far as the natural heritage conservation.
Yes.
And my feeling is that we will be facing no analog situations in the future. That means that we cannot hope to get much from the past on how to deal with these new situations that we will be facing in the future. So I wonder about your comments on that.
I cannot share your pessimism. I think I cannot. One of the case studies that I didn't give you was the question of irrigation in Sri Lanka, where archaeologically, we've done a lot of work on this. And that was the case I gave of sort of over-adaptation. That we have a city, a kingdom, which collapsed through its over-reliance on a particular monumental, over-embellished irrigation system. And in the 13th, 14th century, 12th century, there is a climate fluctuation which leads to increasing dynamic storms. So the question no longer, the city is in the dry zone, so it needs to store water during the wet season to eke out over the dry seasons. The question no longer was how to store water during the dry season, but what to do with too much water. Because too much water was the problem with the uncertainty of rainfall, with massive cyclones, and within their system that had been designed, which was a very simple cascade system, gravity, once one reservoir had blown, every single reservoir in the system blew. Now, when the big investment in sort of irrigation came in with ODA, the Brits were there, they invested 50 million in this huge reservoir up in the hills, Victoria Dam. They found it's never filled properly, it created malaria, it flooded extremely prime land. Actually, the old tank systems, not the mega infrastructure medieval or the modern, but the old tank systems actually were more able to deal with uncertainties and fluctuations of water. So to some extent the scaling is different, the focus is different. I'm not advocating a sort of year zero return to the Neolithic. I know Turkey has a very established and sort of innovative Neolithic, but actually I think we cannot ignore lessons from the past. And like the example in Kathmandu, actually some of the water challenges can be answered, I think, from the channel systems and from learning about their methods of dealing with, for example, overflow from downpours in particular, cloudbursts in particular areas which are becoming more intense. So I think we can learn whether some lessons, so there will be, of course, hybrids, undoubtedly, but actually the challenge is the cultural heritage which possesses the adaptations is being overlooked. Frequently, it's often not protected. It's never really a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It may be low on the listings. And so we're tending to lose it without any recording. And it can play a contribution. Now, this particular grant we have for Kathmandu is exploratory. And that's the beauty of it, that the aim of it is to be interdisciplinary, but also exploratory. So the outputs are not to refix the water system, but to explore the potential research into it to understand more. Now, I would say in India, there's been huge investment in water harvesting systems, renovating medieval systems. So actually, in some cases, it is having a successful intervention. And frequently it's seen as being less irreversible than the massive investment. So yes, there will be massive challenges. I'm not promising to save the world, but with these few examples, I think we can actually rebalance rather than just always mega infrastructure is the only answer. But thank you.
It was a marvelous presentation, thank you. My question is again about the recent earthquake we had almost a year ago. It's a personal question, as an archaeologist, how you would approach if such a drastic disaster happens and you have a tabula rasa situation. Almost 90% of the buildings have been destroyed, like in Antakya. And Turkey, as because of its unique geography, has maybe 4 or 5 strata, starting from early Greek period, Hellenistic period, Roman period, and you have Byzantine era and Ottoman layers on top of each other, especially in Antakya. So the question here is, begins when you decide to restore, even with indigenous materials, the original construction systems, to rebuild those buildings. Which buildings? It comes as a question. Shall we deal with the Roman period? Because they excavate, at the moment you have different layers. And then the question begins, not a scientific or historical question, but an ideological question. Okay, we should build up the Ottoman period buildings, not the one below. And it is a question which we debate in Istanbul also. It's an ideological case, like Ayasofya situation. It became a mosque again. Okay, I'm not coming to that. Let's concentrate on Antakya's situation. How would local people react? What would be their response? And what, as an archaeologist, your response would be? Thank you.
The trap is widening. Thank you. It's a really good question, and I think it's both a question about scale and it's a question about value. So the scale one is the one I find most difficult, which is, you know, having worked on a building, you can get into a building, you can understand a building. It's controllable with the funding you have, with the time you have, the capacity, capability. When you deal with some disasters, whether human, like Mosul, or whether natural, if it really is a sort of ground zero, it's extremely difficult to know. You can't do this for everything. You cannot save every single building. But I think that, in a way, leads to the importance of planning and of discussions beforehand of what's important, what is of value, what is an asset, what is a characteristic. Because what tends to happen is, in the emergency stage, in the reconstruction period, people have so many opportunities. The plans clearly never cover what actually happens because, you know, it's very difficult to predict. But in a way, by first of all having the inventories, by also having an understanding of value systems, by that I mean, how do local communities value monuments? Which monuments do they value? What are, you know, for example, it may be a Byzantine period structure, but what's its intangible value to the local community? Is it seen as a space? So, for example, we did intangible mapping at Gadara in northern Jordan, which was fascinating because in the 1960s and 70s, the whole of the community of the Ottoman village were moved out. And the archaeologists moved in and they left some of the old Ottoman buildings and they started excavating. Here was the theatre, here was the stadium, here were the tombs. The community that had lived there were pushed out into a series of concrete boxes at the edges. We did this really fascinating exploratory walk around the old village with the community, and at one of the old theatres, the women were saying, this is just above our old cemetery, this is where the women would mourn, and this was on top of the old stadium. So, as an archaeologist, I would call it a Hellenistic stadium. For those local community, they had additional values that made it important. So, what I'm saying is, in a way, if one plans, if one undertakes inventories, mapping, and actually establish values before, that can act as a critical guide. What tends to happen is it doesn't happen. So one tends to sort of miss all of that opportunity. In terms of where you turn back to, at the moment, for example, in Kathmandu, no one likes 19th century neoclassical Rana dynasty buildings because they smack of hybridity. They are neoclassical. So many of those buildings are coming down, and there was a proposal from a municipality to remove one and to reconstruct it in a more favourable traditional style. And actually, we were all quite clear on the International Scientific Committee for the Kathmandu Valley that that is also part of the history of that site, of the responses to different environments, to different cultural flows. And now that building is not going to be demolished, it's being retrofitted. So I would say the first is we need to map, we need to understand values, and that mapping and value system, you need to start now. You know, there is no delay, so that if and when you need it, you actually have a very clear view of value. And in terms of popularity and unpopular, I have pet sort of periods that I prefer more, but actually when I'm excavating, I try to record each level the same. But thank you. It's an extremely good question. Thank you.
I think your explanation to the previous question is taking us to the participation. Have you experienced I'm curious about that since I'm really into this issue of participation in the last 5 years. So your explanation has been very interesting to me.
I mean, participation is everything. In Durham, we have a splendid UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's Norman, so it was built by the French invaders when they arrived. We have this huge cathedral on one side, this huge castle on the other. It dominates the landscape with the river running round it. You look at the research strategy for the World Heritage Site, it's understanding dates of particular styles, development of particular architectural elements. There's nothing about the local community, modern community, how they engage with it. We've done surveys within the town square down below our great castle. And if you look at visitors to the castle, they can buy and go around on a tour. The majority of visitors have tertiary education. So almost 80% of our visitors have tertiary education. You look at County Durham as a whole, probably about 10%, less than 10% of the county has tertiary education. We are not engaging our own community with the World Heritage Site. So at the moment, we're working with the Miners' Hall, Durham Miners' Hall, to see if we can encourage them to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, because they are a body which has huge intangible value. There is no more mining, so the communities of those who experience mining have almost a dying out. But what they represent is organized labor and its first sort of steps. And in 1913, they created their own parliament, where they elected members from the different pits. And that, in a way, led to the labor movement, because they were experienced in democratization. So we see our role as not just sitting up in the castle, but actually trying to work with the communities. And the work within Southern Asia is exactly the same. For example, for 12 years we've been working, Japanese funds and trust, on fitting sites for Buddhist pilgrimage. 80% of the population is Hindu, 20% is Muslim. Almost no Buddhists live there. And there is this danger of an overwhelming layer of reception for income and engagement with the outer world through Buddhist pilgrimage and Asia Development Bank. The World Bank see financial benefit from tourism from East Asia, Southeast Asia. But actually, we've done, again, intangible mapping so we can identify what is significant to local communities, what do they value, how can we then, my risk maps are what's below the ground archaeologically, can we actually have risk maps that have both tangible and intangible, so that we're aware of where there are flashpoints, but also where is of significance to the local community. And we've been holding every year festivals, competitions for school children. We invite them to draw what they believe the ancient site once looked like. The Hindu students draw it as a temple, the Muslim students put a beautiful dome on it. So it's really, really interesting that then that's displayed in the museum, they drag their parents in, and that changes generations. So community engagement is absolutely core. Archaeologists tend to build a fence, keep people out. I admire wildlife conservators and the way that's going forward. I think they're streets ahead of us in terms of community engagement and also community custodianship, which has to be the answer. Thank you.
Well, I wonder if anybody has burning questions. Our guest is tired by now, I would think, but he's going to be around if you want to chat with him. We do thank you very much. This was very intriguing, and the discussion was excellent as well. I do hope you come back and make connections and do part of your take part of your research into Turkey as well. That would be great. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.